Just here to introduce this session, tell you a little background about how this all evolved, and introduce our moderator. Thank you. Introduce our moderator, and he'll take it from there. We know that water is one of our most serious challenges under climate change, and this cycle of floods and droughts has been a real serious concern. And we began looking at this back about before COVID began, when Graham Fogg, who was with the university, did a session for us on the fact that there are grand canyons where you can put water in the San Joaquin Valley and below, and that we didn't have to worry about reservoirs anymore, just get the water down there. And from there, this topic has continued. Aaron Fukuda from the Tulare Irrigation District last year told us of what they're accomplishing down there, and from beginning to realize the importance of that aquifer to actually having people making it happen with the support of Sigma has been really fast. But what about the areas in the state, the 42%, which don't have access to the deep aquifer, but have a possibility of storing smaller amounts of water in shallow aquifers? And about 10 years ago, I think a couple of people, maybe three of you, got together and began to brainstorm, what can be done here? And they have moved on to implement a program, and they have put it on the ground, and it's happening today, which gives us a way forward for those people that don't have access to deep aquifers. And so I've worked with these three, or two of them anyway, for quite a number of years. They're fantastic people. I recently met Willie, who is another really innovative and powerful person. So I'm extremely excited about this panel. So we're going to begin with an hour for the panel, and then we'll have 45 minutes of discussion about what they've thrown at you and what we can take of that to continue our quest to address water in California. Okay, Willie, thank you. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Judy. So, hey, everyone, I'm Willie Whittlesey. I'm the general manager of Yuba Water Agency. Yuba Water Agency is just north of here in Marysville, California, about an hour north. We manage primarily surface water, but we're also a groundwater manager in the Sacramento Valley, and we get our water from the Sierra Nevada, primarily snowmelt runoff, and we have a large reservoir. That's my background. I've been asked to moderate this panel, which is very interesting to me because it's a little different than what I'm used to. I operate in the Sacramento Valley with a deep water aquifer, and we sustainably manage that, the Yuba Basin. But I've been asked to moderate this panel on small or shallow groundwater aquifers and all the unique collaborative projects that are going on in Santa Cruz and Monterey County with these collaborators here. I've got with me Andrew Fisher, a researcher at UC Davis here, Brian Lockwood, general manager of Pajaro Water Management Agency, and also Lisa Lurie with the Santa Cruz County Resource Conservation District. Okay, so we're going to go through a series of presentations. Each one of them is going to give a presentation. We'll have a time for discussion at the end, and hopefully you learned something and you're entertained throughout. I'm going to start with Brian Lockwood.
Thank you, Willie. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. I think we have a great three-part presentation for you, and my role here is going to be to really set the stage, sort of the purpose and need of what we're talking about today and how the Pajaro Valley Groundwater Basin got into the situation it is and what we're doing about working towards achieving sustainable groundwater resources. So first, I always like to just take a minute to acknowledge that while you're seeing me up here, there's a huge team behind me. The board of directors sets all the policy for our water management agency, great staff. We work with a lot of consultants, and we work with great colleagues like Andy and Lisa, who we get to collaborate with on exciting projects from recharge net metering to a whole variety of studies over the years. So I'm really pleased that in my job at the agency, I get to work with many other great individuals. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of the groundwater basin and our water resource management activities. And these photos are local photos from our area. This is the basin where the College Lake project we're building is. I'll show you that later. And the sloughs are world famous, draw in birders from all around the world for the annual birding festival. So we're a special district, I'll call it PV Water for short, that we were formed 30 years before the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which was adopted in 2014, and sort of really reinforced all the work that this agency has been doing. And, in short, our mission is to achieve sustainable groundwater resources in the valley, but also to sustain commercial farming while we do it. We are part of 3 different counties, which adds its own bit of complexity: Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Benito. We have 1 large incorporated city. That's the city of Watsonville, which is where our main office is located. And as I said, SIGMA was adopted in 2014, and that was a game changer for us, because prior to SIGMA, our community didn't always love what we were doing. And part of that was because we had to charge fees for groundwater management actions and so forth. And there was no state mandate to do these things. We were just a special district mandate to do it on our own. But with SIGMA and the statewide mandate, all of a sudden our community realized, hey, all this work we've been doing has been helpful, and sort of pushed us kind of to the front of the line with some of the sustainable groundwater management activities. And because of that, we were able to submit our existing plans, which were first developed in the 90s and then adopted most recently before SIGMA in 2014. And that the Department of Water Resources accepted as an alternative to a groundwater sustainability plan. And really what that meant was it kept our momentum. We had spent years planning, doing environmental impact reports at the programmatic scale, and we didn't want to go back to the planning table. We wanted to push forward with the implementation of new projects and programs. That approval allowed that to happen for us. This is an image that sort of shows, where in California we're located. The dashed blue line is the watershed, and the solid black line is the statutory boundary of our agency. So we're sort of in the middle of Monterey Bay, and you can see it from this image. We drain the lower part of the Pajaro Rivershed. We have got about 120 square miles within our basin. Within that basin, there's about 28,000 acres in irrigated agriculture, and these tend to be high-value crops. They can be lots of organic crops, strawberries, organic vegetables, raspberries are kind of the main ones. We also grow apples and a whole host of other things as well. So for those 28,000 acres or so, the annual revenue is about $1 billion, which gives a sense of the scale of magnitude of what the crop value is. And we are almost entirely served by groundwater. So there's approximately 2,000 wells in our basin, pumping anywhere from 50 to 55,000 acre feet in an average year. High years, maybe 62,000 acre feet, lower years, maybe 48,000. So there's a large draw on the groundwater basin, and through time, that's led to lowering of groundwater levels. As you can see in this map, anything shown in red on this map from the fall of 2023 represents water levels that are at or below sea level. And because we're right next to the ocean, when the water levels draw low, saltwater can intrude into our freshwater aquifers. That threatens not only the agricultural production wells, but if it could intrude far enough inland, it can affect the municipal production wells. And it's already affected a large number of rural residential wells. These are smaller wells that may serve 1 or a few households. And there's the seawater intrusion front as it's migrated in from the state's earliest studies in the 1950s to our most current update showing it through 2020, and our staff is working on a new update now. So we have seen seawater progress inland, and we've taken a lot of steps to counter that. And that started back in, the most recent iteration, I should say, began in 2010 when we pulled together a committee of 21 members of our community representing large and small agriculture, the cities, the small water districts, environmental folks, county folks, and so forth, Farm Bureau representatives. And they met for 2 years to come up with the next series of projects and programs to help achieve sustainable groundwater resources. we used our hydrologic flow model, which we had developed with the United States Geological Survey between about 2005 and 2010 to get a sense of what was the magnitude of the offset in our water budget. We talked about what is our sustainable groundwater value, but nobody could decide what determined sustainability at that time. Could there be impacts to the streams? Could there be impacts to water levels and wells? So we took an objective approach just to say, running the model as it is, here's how much water is being extracted from the basin, here's how much is being recharged. So we had a goal of about 12,100 acre feet per year, sort of as our shortfall in our water budget. And then to match that goal, we said, well, if we could really do a robust conservation program, and we actually worked with some scientists from here at UC Davis, Dr. Sam Sandoval-Solis, who did an analysis of irrigation methods in the valley and determined that, yeah, we could save about 10% without having a negative impact to crop production and then crop revenue. So 5,000 acre feet a year from conservation, and then about 7,100 acre feet a year from the combination of optimizing existing water supply facilities that maybe weren't performing as well as they were planned to on paper, and then developing some new water supply facilities. So working, especially now with our partners at the Resource Conservation District, we have a pretty solid water conservation program that's focused just on agriculture. We also have one for sort of home and garden, but because agriculture uses about 85% of the water in our valley, most of the money goes to the agricultural program. And we fine-tuned this program from about 2014 to pretty recently, and have just been putting more funding into it to get more staff to help work with our growers to save water. And that is certainly the most cost-effective method of working to achieve our goals. And then we have water supply facilities. So these include for us a managed aquifer recharge and recovery project that we had constructed back in 2000 or so, started producing water around 2002. And it doesn't get us a lot of water, but we take water from the slough before it flows into the ocean, divert it into infiltration basins where it percolates into a shallow aquifer, and we use a series of wells to pull that water back out over the course of the year. Then our water recycling facility came online in 2009, and that takes most all of the wastewater that flows through the city of Watsonville and some of the surrounding communities, and we can treat that to tertiary standards and put it through our pipelines and distribute it to the farmers. So even though they might have salt water under their land, potentially impacting their wells, from the managed aquifer recharge project, recycle water project, and some of the supplemental water wells that we pump into our pipeline system, we can keep farming in production even though the water might be salty underneath. Recharge net metering is something that came about more recently, but that was around 2014 or 15 or so, where the idea for a pilot program came into play. And it was just one more step to sort of further diversify the water supply portfolios. And, importantly, as you'll hear later, one of the big benefits, in my opinion, of recharge net metering is sort of the community engagement and interest. People, private landowners, really feel like they're providing a strong role, playing a part in helping to achieve sustainable water resources. This is an image of one of our very first facilities. This is the recharge basin at Harkins Slough. And so it's a big pool of water, but compared to other pools of water, it might be very small, depending where you're thinking of. This is about 7 acres wetted. It can hold about 45 acre feet of water, and it's on ancient sand dunes. So it's kind of like going to the beach with your kids or something and running, getting a bucket of water, putting it into that, and then you're filling in. So we're constantly refilling this, and then the water goes into that shallow aquifer where we have a network of wells that pulls the water back out. We've put over 10,000 acre feet into this basin over the last 20 years and recovered about 60% of that or so. And we're working to figure out how do we recover more like 80 or 85% of that water. This is our water recycling facility. It was an add-on to the city of Watsonville's existing wastewater plant. It was really a unique and great partnership between a municipality and a state special district that we could work collaboratively to build this extra component to their facility. It helps the city because we're working to protect the groundwater resources. It helps us because we can treat all that wastewater, or a large majority of it, and put it back into our pipelines. It's right next to the Pajaro River, so it's threatened by flood flows, but you can sort of see it has a little bit of a ring levee all around it. And we're consistently working to improve this facility to help to optimize it. And so we take all that water, and on this map you can see there's really two main colors that pop for me. There's sort of the pinkish red color, that's the seawater intrusion front I showed you earlier, and then that purple color that's on top of it, that's the current extent of our delivered water service area. So that's where we can send all of the water that we can produce to our farmer customers within the coastal area. That helps to reduce coastal pumping, helps to slow the rate of seawater intrusion, and helps to keep agriculture in production. Another thing we do is telemeters on our meters. This has been a more recent program with funding from the Bureau of Reclamation to try to get real-time data to our growers so they can see via logging in over the cloud how much water is flowing through the turnouts or their own wells, and help them better manage their irrigation schedules. This ties into water use efficiency, and ultimately we hope it'll be a big part of our future conservation program. And the growers seem to be really appreciating the ability to get this data in real time, because a lot of them work in offices and have to rely on their irrigators in the field to tell them how much water is being used. So the result of all of this work through time is that we are pumping less groundwater. And you can see that in these graphs, which more or less show 5-year averages up until the 2021 to 2023. But we went from about 44,000 acre feet of groundwater production in 2006 to 2010, which is sort of our base 5-year period for which we compare our future. And in the most recent period, we're more like 35,000 acre feet a year. So that's a good sign. The green bars on the top represent the average rainfall over those periods. The dark blue is agricultural water production. The purple is our supplemental water supply, and the light blue is the domestic water use. So we are seeing it trending in the right direction, which is overall less water use, despite no change in irrigated agriculture. And then a few years ago, I guess 2017 now, there was a neat study published by Meredith Goebel, who earned her PhD with Rosemary Knight at Stanford, where they looked at geophysics along the coastline. And one of the takeaways from this picture here is that there is a benefit from the area where we've been delivering water since 2002. So in this image, red means saltier, blue means fresher, and that area where we've been delivering water the longest is clearly bluer than the area just to the left of it in this figure, where it is redder, and we have now extended our pipeline to service that area right here. And this is a figure we have to send to the Department of Water Resources every year. There's a lot going on here, but the light blue line is sort of the main thing that we're looking at, and that's our cumulative change in water storage over time. And it's trending upward, which means we're getting more water into the groundwater basin. That's the combination of all of these different programs that I've been talking about. So the last part of this is really, we have these existing facilities and the existing conservation program, and it's still not enough. So we're building a couple capital projects. This one, the College Lake project, will produce about 2,000 acre feet a year for us on average. It's an $80 million project to produce that much water. It's going to become operational this year. We're almost done construction. And we're going to take water from a local lake that's been drained for 100 years by a reclamation district and treat that water, send it to our existing pipes, and then sell it to our customers. We have a sister project to our Harkin Slough infiltration basin. It's a little bit of a retreat project because as sea level is rising, we're having seawater intrusion not just into the aquifers, but further up the surface water bodies because the gradient is so mellow or low elevation at Harkin Slough at our pump station. It's only about 5 feet above sea level. So we have king tides in the winter. Sometimes we see water that's half the concentration of salts of seawater at our existing diversion. So we have a new diversion with the pending water right for that. And then this recharge and net metering program, my colleagues are going to talk about that in much greater detail. So I'm just going to say that, I really appreciate the increased involvement with our community members and the excitement that is drawn. My board of directors has been really excited to support this program. We love working with Andy and his team at UC Santa Cruz and Lisa and her colleagues at the Resource Conservation District. And to help pay for all of this are the rates. And so this is important. I wanted to make sure I didn't forget this slide in the presentation because these are rates for the water that we distribute to our customers, that's the very bottom row, our delivered water charge, which you can see by the end of this calendar year is going to be $501 per acre foot. Now that's delivered water at pressure, 80 pounds per square inch. So there's some added benefit there. But all the rows above that, that's water that people are being charged by the agency for pumping out of their own private wells, right? So we have this metering program. They pay to put their wells in the ground. They pay for the electricity, operations, and maintenance of those wells, and they still pay the agency this fee to offset or to provide the revenue so we can make all the capital debt payments on these water supply projects. We've been contested quite a bit on this. If you look up Prop 218 and Pajaro Valley Water, we're in a lot of lawsuits in the early days. But our most recent lawsuits have sort of solidified this uniform rate structure, and it's this rate that we take 50% of it multiplied by the amount of water that gets infiltrated into the ground that provides the rebate to our participants in the recharge net metering program. So in conclusion here, one of my directors long ago when we were having tough times, he said at a meeting that we were just local folks working towards local solutions. And that's really stuck with me over the years. And it's true because our agency, we don't have any ties to the Central Valley Project, the State Water Project. We are really working to get sustainable with our own resources. We were actually formed to bring an import pipeline, and then that went away for political reasons right off the bat. He also said he wants a solution where everybody hurts the least, because when you raise rates, nobody's happy. So you find a way to make it so that everyone hurts the least. We're getting into some new stuff now, too. We have a grant from the Department of Water Resources for regional watershed resiliency planning. We're also partnered with both of my colleagues here and some other agencies for the Department of Conservation's multi-benefit land repurposing plan. So lots of new and innovative things happening, and I feel optimistic that by 2040 we will be at the sustainable status or very close to it. So I'm going to stop there to ensure that my colleagues have enough time, and I think we'll do questions later. But thank you for your attention, and I really appreciate being here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity and the invitation to Judy. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brian. So I had a couple hours this week to review their PowerPoints and get to know these projects, and just what I learned in the last 15 minutes is excellent. I can't wait to have a dialogue about it. But before we do that, we'll get over to Andrew for his presentation. Andrew?
Hi. It's really great to be here, and I enjoyed the session this morning. I'm excited about being here with Brian and Lisa to talk about this program. So I'll tell you a little bit about this recharge net metering program, what it is, how it operates. Lisa's going to focus really on the role of the RCD and the community in helping to operate and sustain the program, and how it links as well to Pajaro Valley Water. So I'll give you a quick overview of the program, how it runs. I describe it as the nuts and bolts, how the payments are evaluated, how they're actually made, what kind of measurements we have to make. I'll summarize some of the results. Lisa will talk about those a little bit too. And then I want to talk about some next steps, because we've been doing some larger picture thinking, both for the Pajaro Valley, but then for other places in California, potentially including the Central Valley, other basins where a recharge net metering or a recharge net metering-like program might be applicable and might be able to scale for some of these larger programs. So quick background first on recharge. We've heard that term, but it's one of the least well understood parts of the hydrologic cycle, because mostly it's cryptic. It occurs around groundwater basins in ways that you often can't really see it. This diagram just illustrates a lot of kinds. The recharge net metering program focuses on infiltration basins, but recharge as a process really occurs in many, many different ways. When you do a water budget for an aquifer, it's typically the largest inflow. There could be others, but that's usually the one that you care the most about in terms of quantification, but it's the one you can't measure directly. So often what happens is people who do water budgets calculate all the other terms and then add them up and take the difference, and that's called recharge, which of course aggregates all the errors, right, for all the other measurements or all the other estimates. It's a natural and it can be an enhanced process. It can have a huge impact on water quality. I'm barely going to touch on that, but please ask if you want to know more about this. It's an important aspect of the issue, and it's heavily influenced by land use and climate. And that brings up this point, that in California, the threat to groundwater is really threefold, right? You've got both increased demand, which is just a function of production of agricultural products, population, and even with per capita water use going down, as we grow, the demand is really increasing. But the other thing that we see is big changes in land use that result in a lot more water running off the landscape quickly after increasingly intense storms. So one of the biggest effects of climate change on precipitation in California is not a change in the mean annual, it's a change in intensity. And this is something that's baked into the record right now. Studies have shown it already, and the models predict an increase. It's both the whiplash from year to year, but it's the intensity in a single afternoon. This has changed, and it's changed in a big way throughout California. And both of the last two reduce groundwater supplies because they reduce recharge. So this is the first thing to really think about. If we don't increase recharge in a huge way, we're never going to get back to where we were 100 years ago with recharge. This is not adding on top of a natural system. It's undoing a fraction of the damage that's been done to the hydrologic cycle because of the way we've changed land use and changes to the climate that are a direct response to human-induced climate change. This is affecting the whole state. There's 127 medium and high priority basins that are implementing groundwater sustainability plans throughout California and have to do so by around 2040, show that they've achieved their balance. But SGMA doesn't require that any restoration be done. It simply requires that you stop at the level of overdraft where you are at the time when SGMA was implemented, okay? So that's a really big deal because in cases where water levels are drawn down below sea level, you don't stop intrusion when you balance your basin. You need to overbalance the basin. You actually need to bring the water back up. Or if you have a stream system that no longer receives base flow because the water levels have been drawn down, SGMA does not restore that. So meeting the requirements of SGMA is essential, and it's not enough. And there's other issues, other challenges within the SGMA framework, one of which is that the state board has said explicitly that they do not consider voiding the 6 undesirable consequences that allow one to achieve the requirements of SGMA. That is not considered to be beneficial use. So think about that for a minute. And we can talk about this in the questions, but it creates real challenges for basins trying to sustain and maintain not just water systems for human use, but aquatic systems that support wildlife, that support important ecosystems, wetlands, streams, and so forth. So I'll also just note, as it says here, that we don't even know how much the statewide overdraft is. There are estimates, but again, they're all done by differencing, and the fact is that without metering, without knowing how much water is being extracted, in many basins, the way we tell how much groundwater is pumped is by counting the artichokes from space. Literally, that's how it's done. So there's a lot we don't know about how much is used, but we know that too much is being pulled out relative to what's going in because of the dropping the water levels, the points that Brian has shown. Now, there are many scales of managed recharge, from low-impact development on the left to these larger spreading systems or even flood-mar. We're inundating large areas, as shown on the right. And these really vary in scale. Low-impact development is often put near the source of runoff. You get a couple acre-feet a year, typically per site. Large-scale projects can generate tens of thousands or even more than 100,000 acre-feet per year. We've been working in the Pajaro Valley at kind of an intermediate scale. And this is the collection of stormwater and then routing it to designated areas that have a high capacity to infiltrate that water by gravity, primarily, using simple ditches and culverts, and then counting how much water goes in the ground, and through the net metering program, providing a partial fee rebate to the participants. Brian told you about the Pajaro Valley, and as he noted, it's a center for high-value ag here adjacent to Monterey Bay, and groundwater is really the only major freshwater supply. So here's how the net metering program functions. I'll use an example here to illustrate. Imagine you have a ranch with 75 irrigated acres. You grow the delicious red berries. They take 2.5 feet of water per year. In this area, the rainfall is about 1.5 feet. And at our sites, we've measured the runoff. It's about 40%, 0.4 as a fraction of the rainfall. So imagine one farm that drains 200 acres of surrounding hillsides, another that drains 400, another that drains 600. The drainage area is not the farmed area. It's the area of hill slopes that surround the farm. And then here are the water fees. So the RENM program operates by counting how much water goes in the ground through a project and then issuing a rebate based on 50% of the current fee. That's the rate right now. So in this example, here's the water use shown in the blue bars. The grower not participating pumps about 190 acre-feet of water to grow all those delicious red berries. The grower whose property drains 200 acres, they're able to actually collect around 120 acre-feet. So that offsets what they pumped. Their net pumpage is about 60 acre-feet. The two growers to the right, draining 400 or 600 acres, their net pumpage is negative, actually, because they're putting more water in the ground than they're extracting. And let me make sure I cover this. So the larger the drainage area, then the more benefit you can provide. And the RCD in UC Santa Cruz, we're the third-party certifier for the program. We document the benefit, and one of the key features of the program is that the participants have to sign a contract at the start and agree not to argue with our numbers. Actually, the agency does too. We count what we think the best estimate is, and everyone has to accept our numbers before we even make them. And finally, then the rebate gets calculated. For the grower who doesn't participate, they're going to pay about $60,000 a year for the water to grow those delicious berries. For the grower whose property drains about 200 acres, they get a rebate of $20K, so their net water cost has dropped to $40,000. And by the time you get to the drainage area of 600 acres, they're actually growing all the berries, pumping the water, and they get a small check at the end of the year. Now, to be clear, they're not being paid for the water. They're being paid to offset the loss of land use and the operation and maintenance costs because the private participants who host the projects are responsible for that maintenance. So that was the key of the net metering program. That was the spark that got us to create this in the first place. Was we knew we had growers, private landowners, who wanted to help create solutions because the agency had done so much work in public outreach and engagement. The tide had really turned at the time when we were launching this program. They wanted to help, but they didn't want to take on the liability and the cost in perpetuity for maintaining these systems. And the RENM program was designed to make them whole, or at least move them towards being whole for those operating costs. In a way, you can think of the recharge net metering program as being like net energy metering, but it's really different in important ways. With the energy programs, people put solar panels on their homes, generate power, the excess goes on the grid, and then the energy company's on the hook to compensate them for the value of that power. And these programs have been quite successful. They started in the Midwest, but California really expanded the program in 1995 originally. But PG&E found themselves on the hook for a lot more rebates than they had planned, and they also realized it was costing them a lot of money because of the use of the infrastructure in order to run that power back on the grid and then serve it to other customers. Also, it's pure power for power. There's no other direct, really, co-benefits. With net metering, because of the cost of operation, the landowners are compensated through the rebate. And underperforming systems can be taken out of the program at any time. There's no obligation for the agency to keep that particular participant, involved. And the program can be revenue net positive because the rebate is pegged at a fraction of the water value, and then some of that water can be served again. So it's very different from the power net metering programs, which cost, the more successful they are, the more they cost the utility. And in this case, it's the opposite situation. And then finally, with getting more water into the ground, you generate a lot of co-benefits along the way. So here's what one of these projects looks like. There's the inflow on the upper left, and then the culvert feeding into an infiltration basin. There's Araceli Serrano, a PhD student who's going to defend her PhD in a couple of months, and she's collecting water samples to analyze and look at the improvements to water quality. And there we are during COVID. I think I have a mask on, collecting our gauges at the end of the season there. This is about 12 years of data from one of the field sites. The x-axis is rainfall. The y-axis is the water flowing into the basin. The goal here was to get 100 acre-feet per year, and when you average out, except for the first 3 drought years when we started and thought this might not be such a good idea, we've hit our goal. pretty successfully. 2023 is there on the upper right. There's a high rainfall year. So the project operates quite efficiently, and it doesn't take up a huge footprint to get that benefit. There's a lot of challenges that GSAs are facing in developing, operating recharge systems. And recharge net metering does not solve all of them, but it solves a lot of problems. One that Brian described that's really important is engaging the public. Groundwater is so cryptic and so hidden, and recharge is as well. And having a way for people to be part of a solution is actually quite important for gaining trust and cooperation for other kinds of programs. And then it provides access to land, and it's something that's directly measurable. So it provides benefits in that way as well. This is the last slide of the subject part of the talk, and just want to point out we're also involved in this multi-benefit land repurposing program, which is integrated with a levee setback project to try to provide better flood risk mitigation for the Pajaro River. And as levees get set back and more areas and floodplains can be exposed and managed, then we can enhance recharge through losing streams as well. And there's a lot of other ways to think about enhancing recharge and how those benefits can be counted while also improving habitat, improving water quality, managing sediment export, and other benefits that are provided, as well as getting more water in the basin for the long term, because a lot of what you put in won't be pulled out the next year and used, but you're actually going to start building back towards improving water levels in your basin. So the summary is that managed recharge is here, it's happening, it's growing, but it needs to grow more. It needs to grow faster and better because we're falling behind in terms of offsetting the losses that we're seeing in snowpack and in recharge through other mechanisms. We need to do it well by finding the right places and then measuring the benefits. We need incentives. I think even for flood-mar inundating large areas, we need to reckon with the cost that landowners incur by hosting those projects, and incentive-based programs are a smart way to go in engaging and compensating people, not paying for water, but helping to make people feel that they are getting a reasonable deal through those projects. Groundwater recharge provides many hydrologic system services. I didn't talk about those, but that's yet another way that these projects can multiply the benefits. And sometimes we're asked at meetings, especially with agency and regulatory groups, about the risks. And I'd say you need to start by imagining the risk of not recharging. We've done that experiment in 127 basins and gotten the same result. We already know the answer. The risk of depleting and damaging these systems is 100% if we don't do this. So it's coming. We just need to figure out a better way to do it and how to engage people along the way. I'll acknowledge lots of people who've helped to run this program, collect the samples, assess the sites, and so forth over the years. And I also want to acknowledge our funders. The money has come from federal, state, local philanthropic groups to help develop this program, and we're grateful for that support as well. So I'll yield to Lisa. She'll tell you a little more about the RCD and their role, and we can have a discussion. Thank you very much.
And thanks, Andrew. And while they're getting Lisa's slides up, I will apologize. I said he was a researcher from UC Davis. He's a researcher from UC Santa Cruz. Sorry about that, Andrew. We'll let the record be corrected here. So I mentioned I got to breeze through these slides earlier this week in preparation for being the moderator here, and there's a reason why we don't just click through slides here. There's a reason why we sit here and have folks explain these projects. These things don't just happen. I'm just putting myself in the position so far here of both Brian and Andrew and thinking, this is the net result. If we're talking about net metering, this is the net result of years and years and years of work, and I have many questions already about talking with landowners and how to convince them that this is going to be a good thing, right? So be prepared. I'm gonna quiz you on that. Okay, Lisa, you're up.
Good segue. All right, first I'll just ask everyone to bear with me. I woke up without a voice this morning, so we're going to do our best here. My name is Lisa Lurie. I'm the Executive Director with the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County, and a really grateful partner to be a part of this effort and a part of this community, working to improve our water resources and sustain agriculture in the Pajaro Valley. So I'm going to tell a bit of the origin story of the Recharge Net Metering program, and talk about some of the different roles of the different players. And I hope to kind of seed some ideas for you all to be thinking about how this model that we're developing and showing great success in the Pajaro might be applicable or adaptable to the basins and the communities in which you live. So to be thinking about that as we go through this. So first off, what are resource conservation districts? I do like to start here because we are often thought of as one of the best kept secrets in local government, and we need some really good PR to change that. So resource conservation districts, special districts, and we are formed to meet the specific need of communities for voluntary resource conservation. Our origins come out of the Dust Bowl era. We have very strong roots in agriculture, and we really work with our communities to identify what are the primary challenges to conserving natural resources, and then how can we work together to overcome those challenges, whether it's technical assistance, financial assistance, and above all else, partnership. How can we be working together to be bettering our management of natural resources and sustaining our land uses? We serve as local hubs within our communities for connecting people with one another, and for connecting people with resources to address some really big, sticky issues. We're accountable, and really our ability to do successful work in our communities is based on trust. It's based on relationships. We're led by boards of directors of local landowners, so we're really embedded in what those local needs are. So some of those kind of key aspects of what RCDs are, you'll see reflected in this program: voluntary, collaborative, community-led, science-based, and trusted and accountable. So how did this partnership and how did this Recharge Net Metering program originate? And what's kind of the special sauce of that, of bringing something like this to be? And I have to say, from the panel this morning, I was truly inspired. And what it left me with was this feeling of, how does anything great start? It starts with people. It starts with people who are committed. It starts with people who are creative, who are relentless. And the case of the Recharge Net Metering program was no different. So some of those people are right here on this panel. But there was also a really active and engaged group of local landowners, champions, who were influential in the community. Brian described the really in-depth outreach process that the agency did in developing the basin management plan. Very thoughtful, very intentional, and comprehensive. At the same time, a group of some of the most influential landowners in the valley really set out a call to action to their peers. Literally in the newspaper, they put out a letter saying, groundwater is overdrafted. Agriculture is part of the problem, and agriculture has to be part of the solution. The solution is not an importation pipeline. This is a local problem, and we are committed to solving it locally. And it's going to take a shared sacrifice. And so if you're with us, if you agree to these principles, join us. And that was truly revolutionary. I mean, to put out a public notice like that coming from these large agricultural landowners. And so that spawned what was called the Community Water Dialogue, people coming together in dialogue, talking about what are local solutions, what can we commit to, and what can we commit to advancing. And all of these ideas are meant to be implemented in tandem and in part of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or at that time, the Basin Management Plan, in partnership with the agencies, but really fundamentally driven by ideas generated from the community, from local landowners. And Recharge was one of the strategies that came out of that dialogue, and specifically Recharge on private lands. And so you have some of these large landowners saying, hey, I have this portion of my land that seems to be regularly inundated or is more vulnerable to risks of flooding. Maybe I could be part of this solution. Is there a way we could modify this for it to turn what's a risk to my production into a benefit for the basin? So here you see the partnership that kind of formed out of that, starting with landowners, their tenant farmers, of course, the Resource Conservation District, bringing that kind of convening ability and technical support. The Water Management Agency, it cannot be understated how important the openness of the agency to explore these ideas and to think about their role and the power that they could bring in providing an incentive. And then the university and Dr. Fisher's lab of really thinking about, okay, how do we make this accountable? How do we make this a trusted program so that we are really measuring impact and linking incentives to those measurable impacts? So the success of launching this program really came from that creative thought process. It came from establishing up front, like Andy said, these agreements between the participants that we're going to go into this, but we're going to agree to what the science says in terms of the benefits and not challenge those. And also, when we launched the program, we came at it from the standpoint of a pilot. And again, you think about anything with innovation, like you could be completely paralyzed by lack of complete information or not having every stone unturned. But if we can at least move something forward and think about it as a pilot, like let's just try it out. Let's just see what works. Let's take a little risk here. And I think the agency really came with that spirit of, okay, let's give it a try. So we did a 5-year pilot. And I think that was really important to the start. So how does it work? Again, this is a voluntary incentive program that's meant to motivate private landowners to come to the table, to share some skin in the game, and to identify sites that are most suitable and have the greatest potential for recharge, to design systems that will that are anticipated to have like a threshold benefit for recharge. Those systems are then monitored for infiltration, and then the rebate credit generating from that. So the benefits of this work are many, and we've kind of talked through some of those. I'm going to kind of now talk through the different steps in this process and specifically the roles of the RCD and the university in moving projects forward with landowners. So there's some key stages along the way, from planning to construction and maintenance, and then the monitoring and reporting, all of which, by having this neutral party, a shared partnership between the RCD and UC, really gives legitimacy and also helps get the work done on the ground. So I'm going to talk through each of these phases here. So first, planning. So this goes back many years at this point in working with Andy Fisher's lab to first do a basin-wide or county-wide, eventually, assessment of suitability for recharge. So looking at surface and subsurface characteristics, doing modeling, looking at trying to do a kind of a broad brush evaluation of where would we expect there to be the highest suitable sites for recharge. From that, you can have what might be modeled to be a suitable site, but what makes it a workable site is, one, ground truthing that through site-specific evaluations. We do that through a number of different technologies that are demonstrated here. Even if a site is suitable, you need a willing landowner and a landowner who is, in this case, willing to essentially donate that land. While we're doing incentives to offset the cost of maintenance and we're bringing public funding in for project design and implementation, at least currently the landowners are essentially donating that land into the program. That's not an insignificant contribution. Then once you've assessed a site for suitability, then we move into project design. These are engineered systems. So we're looking at ways to maximize, this is distributed stormwater collection. So looking at peak flows and how can we maximize the collection of those peak flows into basins. We do a pre-treatment to remove sediments and then the recharge basins. All of that takes permitting, which again, for a landowner whose primary occupation is farming and working the land, having support through that permitting process is really critical to move projects forward. So that's a role that the RCD plays. And then entering into agreements so that as we're making these public investments into these projects, that we have that shared commitments to maintain them and move them forward. And then moving projects into the construction phase. The RCD helps with project bidding and oversight. We bring in funding through grant programs, federal and state funding primarily for the construction costs. And then we're in it in a partnership too. Once we complete the construction of a project, we don't walk away. We're there as a partner to the landowner for adaptive management as projects may need to be evolved. And then the landowners are really taking on the maintenance with the incentive funding support from the agency. The RCD and UCSC, through our monitoring, we're helping provide guidance to them on what maintenance may be needed. This piece, Andy talked through a bit in terms of how that monitoring then ties into the rebate. But it's a really important piece in terms of public accountability too. We report out at the PV Water Board meetings and have a really sound justification for the rebates that are then offered to the participating landowners. To date, we've implemented 3 projects in the Pajaro Valley. We have a 4th in process. Really, our threshold that we found for these projects to be cost effective is to be aiming for advancing projects that would be expected to have at least 100 acre-feet of recharge per year. Those are generally 1 to 4 acres in size. And the draining watershed areas, I don't think we have those on here, but I want to say 100 acres at least. Does that sound about right? And so you'll see 2 of these basins have been hitting those targets. The Stores Basin was one that was in place before the program really got going. And while it's smaller and not quite at the scale that we would advance going forward, it was strategic in the partnership and the place in the basin in which it was implemented. What I want to emphasize here, and Andy showed some of the data from like the drought years to our high water years. We think of these projects really as insurance, right? It's making an investment today that will pay off in those years of heavy rainfall. And so in a lot of ways, this recharge net metering program is an insurance on top of all of the other programs that the agency is moving forward. So this is a yes and strategy. Our colleagues at the Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment did a cost-benefit analysis of the recharge net metering program. And really what this shows is that net metering and managed aquifer recharge are really cost competitive when we look at alternative programs. And again, this isn't an alternative to those other infrastructure programs, but it's a really cost-effective and in our case, effective addition to those programs. Now, I wanted you to be thinking about how this program might adapt to the basins in which you live and work. This program is really adaptable at its core. And so what does it take from a governance standpoint? At its core, it takes participants, so landowners who are willing to participate. It takes a water agency who's creative and open to exploring these types of ideas and willing to consider their role in providing incentives. And then it takes this, a collaborative of agencies to serve in this third-party role. to be fulfilling the role of project implementation, project monitoring, and accountability. Who plays those roles could vary by basin. And then in our case, again, at its core, it's an incentive linked to measured infiltration. For us, that incentive is a rebate off the water bill, and we're implementing the projects through these infiltration basins. The incentive could look different, and the action could look different too. So here we have the distributed stormwater collection, which is the type of recharge that we're advancing currently in the Pajaro. But how might we think about how this model could be applied for things like flood-mar, recharge within levee setbacks, recharge in that urban-rural interface, and even things like cover cropping and alternative cropping. How might we adapt the core model here to be incentivizing all of those types of recharge? And this program, it could be a tool in helping GSAs more broadly meet your goals across the state. We know that GSAs are looking at supplementing supply, of course, as part of groundwater sustainability strategies, and really as the lion's share. This graphic here shows the results from a PPIC study that looked comprehensively across groundwater sustainability plans in the Central Valley, finding that about 80% of the sustainability actions were focusing on supply, and of those, half of them were pointing to recharge. So we know that there's an interest, and we know that to achieve these goals statewide, we've got to do it. We've got to make it possible. So where we are now is looking at bringing this program to scale in the Pajaro Valley. For us, that's getting to about 10 projects, 1,000 acre-feet per year, but then also looking at how can we seed this idea to other basins and assist with capacity building and transferring and adapting of this model. So just to wrap up in summary, this program, it's flexible, it's practical, and it's proven as an effective way of having a collaborative incentive-based structure for recharge. And we're really looking forward to the discussion and thinking about how this model could be taken from here. With that.
Well, thanks, Lisa. Well, that's all three of the presentations. It's time for discussion. I'd like to just make sure that you're all comfortable with the format here, and that is we're just going to have a dialogue. We have about 40 minutes, and I want you to feel comfortable asking questions and getting into a dialogue. These folks, I can tell based on their presentations, they're passionate about this stuff. They've been working on it for years. They want to explain it to you. They didn't want to inundate you with too much technical stuff in their presentation, but they're ready to now, right? I mean, that's it. So are there any questions for the panelists? Yeah, sir, I'll bring you the microphone too, so hang tight. Oh, you got one? Here we go.
Hi, I'm not really a part of the water industry, so forgive me if I ask stupid questions. Are there any restrictions or incentives to not putting pesticides and fertilizers and so forth into the recharge basins and not, fouling up the underground aquifer? Is that part of the program?
Yes. The way that we approach this is to not degrade the underlying aquifer, and that requires monitoring. So we run out during inflow events and collect some of that water and send it to an EPA-certified lab and verify that the quality of that water is better than the ambient groundwater. One characteristic of many groundwater basins that are extensively developed is that they're already degraded. And so, at this point, it's not terribly difficult to put in water that's better than what's in the ground. We've also been experimenting with adding carbon to the soils in the form of wood chips, almond shells, a variety, aged wood mulch, other materials, and then putting in samplers and analyzing the improvements that occur as the water goes into the basins. It's something we started looking at when we did some experiments in the Harkin Slough Basin about 20 years ago. And we can improve the water quality beyond what it is when it comes to the basin, with a relatively low-cost augmentation of the soils below the bottom of the basin.
And I would just add too that you're not the only one who was asking that kind of question, right? As we were just thinking about this program, the Department of Water Resources had published a paper called Floodmar, and it was sort of early on as they were flooding almond orchards and so forth in the Central Valley. And we were working on this, and our colleagues down at the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, I remember a phone call saying, "Hey, you see that Floodmar paper came out?" Yeah, I looked at it. Well, it was all about quantity of water, but didn't say anything about the quality of water. And what do you make of that? And what's going on with this recharge net metering program? So the regional board also wanted to ensure that we weren't degrading the water quality, particularly, not so much with respect to pesticides, that was not the bigger concern, but with nutrients especially. But it also raised an interesting question. If, as Andy said, the water was already degraded, and we're putting in water that maybe doesn't meet drinking water standards, but it's still of higher quality than the underlying groundwater, is that acceptable? So for instance, nitrate at 10 parts per million N is the drinking water standard. If the groundwater basin locally from wells is showing a value of, say, 20, and we're putting in water that might be 14, are we degrading the aquifer or are we improving it? And so that was a question that we basically just agreed to talk about and not really write about too much. And the board was more or less okay with that, at least for now. And then in theory, if we could keep putting in water that's, say, 14 relative to the 20, in time, it should come down, and ultimately you'll be at a situation where 14 is what's going in and 14 is what's under there. And then that'll trigger new questions about how do we proceed. But water quality monitoring is an important aspect of this, and some of the work that the RCD and the university have done with these sort of, pre-treatment areas as it flows through these like vegetated wetlands almost. It poses a risk to the farmers because once you have a wetland on your ranch, you're not really supposed to get rid of it, but it does have some benefits to the water quality. And through some of Andy's work at the Harkin Slough Basin I showed you, well, what was it? We were one of like the top denitrifiers. They were able to show that in the first 3 feet or 1 meter of infiltration, there was nearly a 50% rate of denitrification by basically microbes degassing that nitrate back into the atmosphere as nitrogen. So there was another benefit too that we could study, and that's why they've done these tests with the permeable reactive barriers.
Moving from water quality to water quantity, some sites are very good for recharge because of sandy soils, et cetera. Some are very poor because of clayey soils or other problems. What needs to be done to protect good recharge sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, Santa Cruz County is the land use manager, essentially. Groundwater sustainabilities don't have authority over land use, but we're charged with working with our colleagues at the county to, identify recharge zones and try to protect them. In our basin, fortunately, commercial agricultural zone land is very much protected. And so it's difficult to get a rezoning. But then, as you get into the foothills, there's ranch land and so forth. So it's sort of out of any of our control what happens to it. But fortunately, Santa Cruz County is pretty small, and everyone, all the water resource managers, the county folks, we all collaborate and meet pretty regularly. So, there are ongoing discussions. For instance, I serve on the county's Water Advisory Commission, which advises the Board of Supervisors. So as a commissioner, I have some input when they're taking up items that might, for instance, pose a threat to protecting those recharge areas.
I'll just note that I think this is a great question, and it kind of ties into the session we had this morning with protection of different kinds of land values. And historically, recharge has not been, on a statewide basis, has not been a characteristic that's used for zoning purposes. It is in some areas. There are counties or municipalities that identify primary recharge areas and work to protect those. But I think that's something that really does need to be examined. It's going to vary tremendously basin by basin. Some in the Pajaro Valley, where you have dune sands and in some cases old river channels or stream channels that are quite permeable. In other places, the good recharge sites might not have been considered good in Pajaro Valley. So you're going to want to be careful that everything is relative to what's the local situation. But I do think that we should be thinking about where are the key recharge areas. Because if you imagine, forget managed recharge. Most of the recharge that's occurring is happening cryptically across the landscape when it rains, but people don't know where. So you can inadvertently pave over those key areas or in other ways modify the landscape and lose that service, which is maintaining your aquifers, but do so inadvertently. And I do think that needs to be looked at very carefully, particularly in, it's a great opportunity while basins are implementing their sustainable management plans to try to figure out where those locations are and then think about this question. And it would be great if there were statewide encouragement, let's say, for that to occur.
Excellent questions so far. Up there in the back.
Back to water quality. Typically, when you take water from a water sewage treatment plant, you have a bump up in the salinity in comparison to the salinity of the water that's coming from the city to the residents, and then, you know, the sewage treatment plant is discharging water at a higher salinity than that. Are you still, in that circumstance, suggesting that putting in reclaimed water from a sewage treatment plant is, are you still taking advantage of what you consider to be relatively poor water quality, as in, let's talk about total dissolved salts and potentially nitrates? Is, you know, what's you're hoping that recharge helps stabilize the groundwater basin, but what's the impacts on the salinity in the basin?
Okay, I think just maybe for clarity, I'll sort of answer in two ways. One, this recharge net metering program you're hearing about today doesn't use any reclaimed tertiary treated water. So that's just stormwater runoff and whatever salts it might be, the water might be collecting as it's you know, traveling over the ground. As far as the recycled water facility that I talked about earlier, yeah, we monitor that water quality very closely, and it is saltier. We're not so concerned with respect to the nutrients in the water because we hire an agronomist who works with our growers, and ultimately through lots of conversations, we've had the same agronomist since our program went online. So the relationships are there and they're deep and trusted. That's a big part of it. And she can actually work with the growers to save them some money by having them apply slightly less nutrients, fertilizers. But it turns out there's not enough nutrients in the recycled water on itself so that they can really scale back. They still have to apply fertilizer. And we very rarely deliver recycled water as an unblended source. It's pretty much always blended. We purchase some water from the city of Watsonville that's actually treated to potable levels, which is excessive and expensive and not really needed. And we're trying to find ways to no longer do that. But we've done it for the last 15 years as it's been just plumbed right into the system, and it's augmented our supply. So it's been worthwhile cost. But we combine the water that comes out of the recycled water facility either directly with potable water in a clear well, so it mixes before it goes into the pipeline. And then once in the pipeline, we have things like static inline mixers, which are, you know, corrugated parts of pipe that create turbulence and get the water to mix better in the pipeline. So it can mix with either water recovering from our recharge basin or from groundwater wells that we call supplemental water wells that pump into the system. And with this College Lake project that's coming in, that's going to be sending a really high quality source of mostly rainwater runoff into that pipeline as well. So all of these things dilute the recycled water down to a criteria that is useful for growers. We have a Projects and Facility Operations Committee, formerly known as the Water Quality Committee, that meets monthly, and it reviews the water quality in the system on a quarterly basis. We worked with our growers to establish agronomic objectives that we monitor to help ensure that it's there. And then, of course, the Regional Water Quality Control Board requires annual reporting for what they call their master reclamation permit for the production and distribution of recycled water. And as part of that, there's a nitrate management plan. So we have to track the long-term impacts of recycled water, and we'll just call it delivered water application on ranches through time to ensure there's no, nutrient loading within the groundwater basin. So it's something we're, very attuned to. We're paying very careful attention, collecting lots of data and reporting annually.
Wow, that was an impressive answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is going pretty well. We got another question up here up front.
I was just wondering, regarding water conservation program and RENAM, all three of you hit on the key, and that was willing participants. What's the secret? How'd it come about? And what lessons could other basins take from you?
Yeah, great question. I find that one key to success is if you have a few champions within the community who are leading and on board, they're really influencing others around them. And so I find that it's really important to have, to know who those influencers are, who have a consciousness and a shared commitment to problem solving and really starting there. And I think with the recharge net metering program, that was really key, having a few people. And, those were the first people coming forward and saying, hey, could you try out my land? And if anything, it was just sad when we had these willing landowners where it's like, oh, that's just not a good site, But and then it kind of snowballs from there. I'd say the other important thing is approaching landowner engagement from a standpoint of listening and understanding what are the challenges, as opposed to, I have a solution and I'm going to try to convince you that this solution works for you. If instead we're starting from a place of groundwater sustainability is essential to the longevity of your operation, right? And so there's a fundamental commitment to solving that problem within the agricultural community. And so developing the solutions from that standpoint of, okay, we have a shared interest in sustaining this resource. What are options, and what would it take for those options to work within your operational goals? And so in this case, it was understanding, okay, where are there landowners who have this shared commitment to solving the problem, not only for themselves, but for the broader basin, and starting there. And then in talking about recharge, hearing from them, okay, what would you need for this to be feasible in your operation? And it is the technical assistance, it is the financial assistance, and so we can bring that to the table, and they're bringing to the table, okay, here's the sacrifices that I'm going to make, and here's how I'm going to. Things like modifying their rotations and setting aside land. All those things are very real changes that they have to make. And then one other thing I would just say for partnering with landowners is landowners and growers in particular, like they want a solution now, right? It's like having the time that it can take to get projects all the way to implementation, that delay in and of itself can be a real challenge. So being mindful of that, and for us seeing it as our role of, okay, we're going to take on navigating through the permitting process and, helping navigate through designing projects and things like that. And we kind of take it on ourselves of like, okay, we're going to work with you and we're going to move this forward because that the delays that can happen can otherwise ultimately lead to a project not getting to success. So having that like persistence and willingness to like carry it forward.
I think there might be one other thing that they want, just to add on.
Yeah.
And free food and other free stuff. So you have meetings, bare minimum cookies, better lunch, right? You get people to come if there's free food. And then with the conservation program, we're up to offering what is $100,000 a year of sort of financial incentives. So sometimes that might just be free money to a grower to try on a block of their land some fancy new high efficiency sprinkler that they maybe wouldn't have got otherwise. Or it could be splitting the cost on a $20,000 variable frequency drive that allows them to not just have the pump be in binary mode, on or off, but on at a 60% flow rate, for instance. So we'll cover that for growers. And I think free stuff helps.
Excellent. Go ahead, sir.
Comment and compound question about the fees. The comment is people like Ron and I can ask questions till the time runs out. Other people should raise their hands. The compound question about the fees is part one. It looks to me like those fees are high enough to encourage water conservation, more efficient use. Is that in the intent? And has that been a result? The second part of the question is, those fees look affordable for someone growing strawberries or Brussels sprouts. If you're growing alfalfa or rice, they don't look affordable. What lessons can be learned about recharge in other areas from this approach?
Yeah, well, there's no one growing rice or alfalfa in the Pajaro Valley. Apples are probably one of our lowest value crops, although, prior to World War II, I understand the valley was, flowing with apples everywhere. You might have heard of Martinelli's sparkling cider. They were established in 1850 and harvested a lot of their apples from this area until the apples went north. In the old days, there used to be sugar beets in the valley, and before that, barley, malt, and hops, which goes into some things you might know. When our fees have been the subject of much discussion and, as I said, lawsuits over the years. When we wrapped up our committee in 2010 with this basin management plan outline, it sort of adjourned, and any folks who were not ratepayers were sort of thanked for their time and excused, and then those that were ratepayers stayed on for the next committee, which was the ad hoc rate setting committee. And so we did a lot of work with our community to try to figure out, because of the lawsuits and the threats to the rates, might they want to go a different approach? Some people wanted to have a tiered rate structure. We also talked about zones of benefit, time of use, and then the uniform. And we made tools with our consultant team, spreadsheets that had locked cells and open cells. So you could, for instance, choose how many tiers you wanted in your tier rate structure, and based on those, have some minimums and maximums on what the allowable rates could be, and handed it out to our community, our committee, and they were able to, tinker with it themselves and see what worked or what didn't work. And that was a really helpful exercise, because then they were in control. We just told them, here's what the debt service needs to be, here's what the revenue needs to be based on the projects you've selected. Ultimately, the committee had agreed to continue with the uniform rate structure because we had just gotten through, I don't know what it was, but almost a decade worth of lawsuits. And this uniform rate structure, the groundwater augmentation charge, was sort of tried and true. There's an extra cost for being inside the delivered water zone or service area, and that's sort of twofold. One of it is because even if you're not buying the delivered water, so many of your neighbors are, there's going to be a benefit to the basin. But maybe more importantly, you have what we would call immediate access. So if your well went down, you could get water from our system. There was a thought that as the rates go up, I mean, the inside delivered water zone rate is $486 at the end of this year, compared to buying delivered water at $500. You know, there was definitely thought into that. How do we make it more competitive so that we drive people to buy the water we're producing rather than pumping groundwater? And that's a little bit backfired on us because the demand for delivered water is about twice what the available supply is. So not everybody gets all the water that they want, and some customers don't use any of our water, and they're angry at us because they're still paying this higher fee. And they make a good point that by not taking the water, they're sort of helping the other customers, some of whom don't have any wells, get the water they need. So that's going to be a big topic when we get our next rate committee going later this year. We set our rates for 5-year periods. There was an interesting paper published by a colleague, Ellen Bruno. She earned her PhD here at Davis. She now works for UC Berkeley. She's an agroeconomist. And she took an independent look at crop changes through time, basin salinity through time, and most particularly the rates through time. I don't have that paper in my slides here, but I could get it out to you all if it's of interest. She was concluding that the higher rates were sort of driving the crop types, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I sort of think that the crop type selection has been driving the higher rates because apples use about 1/2 foot of water per year, where raspberries could be, you know, more like 2 or 2.5 feet of water per year, depending on where you are. Strawberries about 2 feet. So there has been some interesting studies about the rates and where that's driven, if it's driven conservation, yes or no. You know, I don't know the numbers entirely, but we do build pipelines through strawberry fields sometimes, and so we have to pay for crop loss. And, you know, gross revenue per acre of strawberries, I've heard numbers of $90,000 to $100,000, and then you have to take out all the expenses. So there, you know, there are the kinds of crops being grown in our valley that can handle the rates that are of this magnitude, especially when, you know, you're talking organic strawberries or raspberries. But it is an interesting question. I think it's one that will be looked at, and now that Ellen's paper was published late last year, I think there'll be sort of continued studies of how that goes in the future. Did I answer your questions? More or less.
And I'll just add that, you know, in these basins that are dealing with SGMA or sustainability, and probably less in this basin and others in more challenged groundwater basins, the fee isn't necessarily the fee. The fee is, are we going to be able to farm or not? And are we going to be able to be creative and come up with a way to share the minimal amount of water we have to farm versus not farming? And fortunately for these folks here, they got creative. And yeah, you might look here and go, it's expensive. Is it going to impact the ability to farm? The reality is the gross revenues, we just heard on some of these products, are such that they can farm, and at least they have that option. They're still in business. Andrew.
That's right. Oh, sorry. Just real quick. We also hear pretty regularly that on a grower's budget, the water cost is still the lowest line item. You know, labor is the highest, but they're still paying more for packaging than they're paying for water. But the margins are so slim that as the rates for water continue to go up and everything else goes up, it's not like they're getting a lot more money from, you know, the supermarkets that are selling those strawberries. The supermarkets, as Aaron Fukuda said one time, what would you say? Farmers are rate takers, not rate setters. And so, makers, that's right. So the margins do get slimmer through time, which puts folks at risk.
I just wanted to comment that it is certainly true that the water costs here are high relative to many other basins and many other water sources. One of the other things that we've been talking about in thinking of extending the concept of net metering is what other kinds of incentives could there be? In a place where the water costs are not as high, it may be that a direct payment makes sense as long as it's cheaper than the next available water supply. That may still be economically reasonable for that basin. Or perhaps there could be other benefits depending on, you know, the economic conditions and what options are made available to participants. And I think that's something that we'd love to hear more about if other people have ideas, other kinds of incentives that could tie into creative activities, whether it's, we're focused on recharge, and there's certainly a lot of potential here, but as Lisa pointed out as well, for things like cover cropping or other management characteristics that provide benefits, including benefits to a groundwater basin, they could be incentivized potentially as well. And maybe that's in part based on water rates, but maybe it's based on other factors or other calculations as well.
I have a question for all of you, actually, if you don't mind. Just curious, because this is an ongoing subject. How many people in the room think that recharging water just for the purposes of putting into a basin ought to be considered a beneficial use of that water? Yeah. Me too.
Okay, so one of my questions, I'll get to you, but this is related. One of my questions, it might have been you, Andrew, you talked about the 6 undesirable results or whatever, and it was in a dialogue about beneficial uses. Can you just expand on where we were going with that question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and you can tell it's one of the soapboxes that we get on when we're chatting with each other in particular. So just by way of background, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is intended to prevent any one of 6 undesirable consequences, and I won't remember them all, but it's overdraft broadly, it's seawater intrusion, it's impacts on surface water systems, it's subsidence, decreasing storage. Some of them kind of overlap with each other, but they've defined 6 things you're supposed to avoid in a way to be comprehensive. And when the state board thinks about authorizing a permit in order to divert surface water to be used in groundwater, even if it's in the middle of a historic storm, that permit is based on the idea that the water that's diverted is surface water. It goes in the ground, it remains surface water. You bring it back out, it's surface water, and now you apply it. They will acknowledge that there may be non-extractive benefits, but they are not happy about that. They've approved permits for non-extractive benefits, but they're in very specific cases, and they're not anxious to expand that. So I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, they put out this one-page document. It's a little PDF. You can find it at the State Board website, and it basically says that here are the 6 undesirable consequences SGMA's intended to avoid, and none of them is a beneficial use. What they're basically saying is, well, you can claim a beneficial use, but you need to do that kind of independent of meeting SGMA requirements. Like, you can do it along with meeting SGMA requirements, but that meeting those requirements per se is not beneficial use. That's really the hook here. So it's a conundrum because there are the 6 undesirable consequences, and there are, in addition, ways that recharging, that infiltrating water and recharging provides a variety of services. It provides a variety of benefits. The trick is what they say in this document is you have to, whatever you claim, you have to prove, right? So let me just give you the simple scenario. Let's say that you get a permit to divert and you're going to pull water out and you're going to put it on your crops. If you just make those 2 numbers match, they're happy. We're going to put in 100 acre-feet. I'll pull out 100 acre-feet. I'm going to put on my crops. Done. But if you say that we're going to put water in the basin and that's going to help to raise water levels over time and that's going to improve, say, stream habitat, they say prove it. Prove that not that you just will get it, but that you do get it. It's a higher standard, essentially. So if you want to use meeting SGMA as beneficial use, you have a much higher bar. Whereas de facto, if you just say I'm going to put it in the ground and then I'm going to yank it out and water crops, you're good to go. You don't have to prove anything. That creates a real challenge, I think, for meeting the SGMA requirements. Because for many basins, they're going to struggle to find that balance. The other issue, of course, is you might put 100 acre-feet in the ground, but it's unlikely you're going to get all of it back. And how exactly you're going to decide how much stays in the basin is not clear, and it's not clear how that would be beneficial use then, because you're leaving that surface water that you were permitted in the ground, which seems to be contrary to their directives. We're confused.
And based on what I think the public, or what you guys just did by raising your hand about should this recharged water be considered a beneficial use, I think the public would agree. There's going to be policy decisions and policy arguments about this. I mean, Sigma's only 10 years old, and the plans weren't even required to be submitted until 2020, so we're really 5 years under plans. So this is going to evolve, but I'm going to take a step back. I know I'm going to get to your question, sir. I know you want to ask a question, but take a step back and just say, there's a ton of opportunity with groundwater and groundwater management. And areas of the state, and I'm not talking about your area in particular, I'm just generalizing it with groundwater. Areas of the state have been managed well, and areas of the state have had challenges with their management and impacts from those challenges. There's a huge opportunity to get this right over time and to recharge these basins, whether they're deep basins in the Central Valley or these small basins on the coast. They all have their challenges, saltwater, subsidence, whatever it might be. There's an opportunity to get this right, and over time, I think with smart folks and collaborations like we're seeing here, we will get this right. Help spread the word. We need to critically think about this and manage our groundwater basins because there's a huge opportunity there. I wish I knew the statistic. I'm going to say there's millions of acre feet in the soils of California. There's enough storage in the soils of California to manage California's water needs. We got to do it right. We got to do it smart. We got to have good policy. We have good researchers and good policy folks to make this stuff happen. Okay, that's my soapbox. Sir, you got a question?
Another stupid question, perhaps. Is there any way to use the discharge basins for agriculture? I'm thinking like cranberry bogs or rice fields or things like that, so they can do double duty and maybe help clean the water as well?
Yeah, it's going to come down to the soil conditions. In many cases, bog-like environments or rice paddy-like environments have hydrophobic soils, so they don't necessarily infiltrate rapidly. On the other hand, if it's a large enough area, and even if it's slow, it'll eventually work its way in. That's, of course, how these aquifers were filled over millennia. I was thinking about our presentation this morning, thinking back 10,000 years, what things were like. Back before groundwater was developed, all the basins were full and they were recharging. How could that be? Because they were also discharging, right? The systems as they were before humans got involved were throughputs of water. Groundwater's in motion. And if you think about what restoration really means, I mean, I don't know that I'll live to see it, but that's what the ultimate goal is to have a system that is cycling water. Because that's how you get all the benefits. You have the storage, you have the drought preparation, you have dilution of salts, you have maintenance of water quality, you have the outflow to streams supporting fish habitat, you have the outflow at the coast making hard grounds that forms fish refugia for the rockfish. I mean, all of it, right? That's what a working system is. The water is cycling through. And the problem is, it's really hard to get back to that. So I went on a little digression there, but to get to your question, possibly, if it's a large enough area and the water quality is right, you'll probably get some infiltration benefit. But in general, rice paddies, cranberry bogs, those aren't great sites for recharge just because they're perching water. They're holding water by their nature. Rice paddies provide lots of habitat benefits, though, for migrating birds. So that's another benefit, right? Maybe just not for groundwater.
Yeah, well, and what you bring up is, it's one thing to think about how might a basin be managed or structured to kind of do double duty, but also stepping back to think about, ultimately what we're trying to do, like Andy's describing, is restore some of the more natural hydrologic processes across our landscapes where now they're currently so altered. And so things like soil health improvements across a broad landscape, ultimately that's part of the solution, right? Thinking about across our grazing lands or across our agricultural lands more broadly, everything that we can be doing to be improving soil quality and water infiltration through healthy soils is it's kind of that distributed recharge across the landscape, and ultimately that's what we're needing too.
Maybe I can kind of tee off that a comment and then kind of a question. Some folks may know there's there's an increasing need for counties to actually take into consideration in their well permitting ordinances the impact of new wells on stream flow depletion. And litigation up in the Scott River Valley around this seems to, and also in Sonoma County, has seemed to set this standard that there's a need for counties to have to essentially come up with a means by which assessing new wells and whether those wells will have a significant impact on stream flow through a depletion factor, and whether that would affect public trust resources. So this is separate and aside and parallel to Sigma and all the talk that's happening here. And Lisa, to your point, it's a distributed, management issue, because it could be down in these basins, though it's complicated with Sigma implementation. But when you get out of the Sigma basins, this concept of groundwater sustainability is still at play, and where it becomes an issue is, I think, for water rights and for water supply, especially in rural watershed areas. When somebody wants to put in a well, is there the groundwater sustainability and stream flow sustainability to be able to support a new well or not? And when it gets out of balance and there's a depletion beyond a certain point, the downstream effects are numerous, including all the way down in the lower basins where you no longer have that inflow contribution. But for people who have appropriative water rights on a given stream, that new well may be depleting stream flow such that it's actually impacting somebody else's water right. And when somebody wants a new appropriative water right, they have to do an analysis of potential impact to other existing water users, whereas for the most part today, people can more or less put in a well without having to consider that. And Santa Cruz County just adopted a new county well ordinance to attempt to address this, and it's a very complicated issue that Sonoma County is wrestling with, as are other counties. But now to my question, which is is to the extent that this recharge work is considering the importance of trying to work further upslope to have these multiple benefits for ecosystem benefits, but also water supply security and reliability for existing water users, as well as creating the capacity for new wells where that's the only water supply for people.
Yeah, a great question. And I think that's for the recharge net metering, the incentive program itself, it has been focused on these basin projects, but it's in a broader context of land management, land stewardship. And I mean, right now, the work that we're doing, Brian mentioned the irrigation efficiency. We tie that with irrigation and nutrient management, kind of to the water quality question of, like, we do need to be working upstream on those land-water interactions, and then similarly from an infiltration standpoint, working with landowners on adoption of other management practices for improving that infiltration across the broader landscape. Right now, it's not linked to this recharge net metering program, but that's we're kind of thinking about how might we be able to quantify and incentivize other practices upstream that are contributing to a basin benefit.
Thanks, Lisa. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. I know that you are a forestry management expert, that you did that before you became in your current job. I think we'd have about twice as many people here if it weren't for the LA fires, because that's where they all are now. Could you talk about the relationship with recharge and what this group has been doing, and fires and forests?
Yeah, I will. So I think Andrew just answered a question about, kind of talked about the soil profile and how it's constantly circulating as part of the water cycle. And when you're a young college student or even in high school and you learn about the hydrologic cycle, especially in California with our Mediterranean climate, and I'm in the Sierras, so I don't get the coastal fog, it's totally hot in the summer and dry. In the forests of the Sierra Nevada, and that's what I'll refer to here, I'm stepping away from the coast, I'm stepping away from the saltwater, I'm going into the forests of the Sierra Nevada. The way I try to characterize the water-forest interaction is there's another whole layer of the hydrologic cycle you don't learn with the basic hydrologic cycle, and that's the soil profile. And when Andrew just kind of described it being constantly flushing through or constantly cycling, I think it's easier to think about it in a mountainous terrain. When you think about it in a valley, where you think about the water comes out of the foothills and goes into the valley, and it just percolates to a volume of water that's somewhere in the valley, 100 foot below the surface, 50 foot below the surface, and it ends there. If you think about that on a mountain, and the water hits the mountaintop, and it goes through the soil profile and makes its way into the aquifer, and it's a different aquifer, it's a fractured rock aquifer, but nonetheless, that water still goes down to a point where it eventually comes out as a little creek or a spring, and then it makes its way to a larger river, and it makes its way to the Yuba or the Feather or the Sacramento, and makes its way downstream. The wildfire issue and the forestry management issue that's been going on since settlement, 170 years, has impacted that hydrologic cycle. It has increased the evapotranspiration. You have climate change. We'll just set climate change aside. Just the density of our forests because of the lack of natural fire, our fire prevention has caused more vegetation per acre, which has increased the evapotranspiration and increases the amount of the water that's taken out of the top, whatever it is, 6 inches of soil for grasses and shrubs, a couple feet for medium-sized hardwoods, and then deep tap-rooted conifers, taking water out of a deep soil profile, and just transpiring that water into the atmosphere. It's not making its way through the profile and into these streams. Okay, so that's what happens when you have an unburned but overstocked forest in the Sierra Nevadas. Then you get a mega fire. Let's talk about the Camp Fire in Paradise or something like that. The Dixie Fire around Lake Almanor that burned over the crest of the Sierras from the west slope to the east slope. These major mega fires. And what we call them is their stand replacing, timber stand replacing. All the vegetation dies. Then you have what we talked about, hydrophobic soils and bogs and cranberries and rice fields. You have hydrophobic soils on the surface of the forest floor now. You have this charred forest floor. It's crusted, it's charred, it has a chemical resistance to water infiltration. Now you have a flashy runoff. So before we had overstocked soils, or overstocked forests where the trees were taking all the water up, and now the water is hitting the soil and just making its way to the river and shooting out into the delta before it can percolate through. So that's my version of soil, forest management, wildfire 101 based on water supply and groundwater. There's much more to talk about in that. Devastating what's happening in the state the last 5 to 7 years. It's a product of many years of many policy decisions, but what's happened in the last few weeks in Southern California is just devastating. So. Didn't want to take away from this panel and the great work they're doing, the collaboration and partnership they have going on. That's wonderful, but I knew Judy was going to hit me with that question, so that's my canned 5-minute answer there. Thanks, Judy. We're getting close to the end, right? How about any final questions for the panelists? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so one thing I was curious about is the management of this particular GSA through the water district, because it was statutorily set up. It's been involved in groundwater management for pre-SGMA, and so it kind of has a history of building connections with the community in order to embark on these big projects. However, one thing that I've noticed with a lot of GSAs is that they don't seem to be nearly as unified, especially in the board members. There are factions that emerge. I was looking at the bylaws for who's eligible to be a board member on the water district, and for certain appointed members, 50% of them, or for certain board members, they need to earn 50% of their income from an agricultural business. And so there seems to be a lot of connection to the community between this water district and the GSA as compared to, and less connection between other GSAs. So I'm wondering how feasible, sorry, that was a lot of pretext, but how feasible is it for other GSAs to really embark on these big projects when the governance structure is not nearly as unified as it is in this GSA? And I'm wondering how much of that, how much have you personally seen your governance structure help facilitate advancement of these big projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to elaborate on our structure, we have a 7-member board, 4 of whom are elected, each representing a electoral division based on population, 3 of whom are appointed, and those are the directors that have to have close ties to agriculture. Those that are appointed, 1 from Santa Cruz County, 1 from Monterey County, and 1 from the city of Watsonville. And I think as far as GSAs go, we're simplicity. We're one groundwater sustainability agency for one basin and one plan to rule it all, right? And that makes it good. And there's also not a lot of competition to get on our board. In fact, right now I have 2 vacant seats out of a 7-member board, and both of them happen to be from appointees. A few years ago, we had a 20-year director who was the chair, decided that 20 was her number, and she felt she did her service and retired, and it took us about 18 months to get that filled. So that's been a challenge for us, is trying to generate interest of why you'd want to serve on our board. You know, and I do collaborate with a lot of other water resources managers around the state, but it'd be a challenge for me to say, you know, about the dynamics of their boards and with respect to instituting a project or a program like recharge net metering. You know, some GSAs in our local area don't have any staff or hardly have any staff, right? They're composed of joint power authorities of other water districts in the county, for instance, and maybe they have 1 person. So there are a lot of things that have lined up for Pajaro Valley Water to be able to initiate a program like this. The directors are well connected with the community. You know, I attend the Farm Bureau meeting every month and can be held accountable for things the agency does. I attend part of the local Rotary. You know, anything we do, we've entrenched ourselves in the community to help improve the community relations so that we can develop innovative programs like this with the support from the community to the greatest extent possible. I think that'd be a good question, you know, for other water resource managers. You know, I'm probably not the most qualified to talk about that.
I just want to not forget as we wrap up here, we've got, Lisa and I put together a handout, and we're going to leave them out here on the counter at the front if you want a little more information. It's got our contact info there, and we're happy to follow up on topics, provide papers, reports, and other things.
Excellent, thanks. So we're going to wrap up here. I got 3 levels of thank you, so it'll take me a minute here. First off, I want to thank you 3 for working on such a collaborative project. This is an example of how we're going to solve water supply issues in California. It's one wonderful coastal example, and I know it's taken you years to get to where you are, and there's a lot more work to do. Like, you have a rate structure thing coming up, and there's all kinds of stuff you have to do. But what they're doing here is going to benefit everyone in California, not because someone's going to replicate exactly what they're doing because their conditions are unique to where they are, but the model on getting together with a water agency, a researcher, a resource conservation district. In the forest space, that might be the U.S. Forest Service, that might be CAL FIRE, and that might be a county or a city. I mean, it's just an example. So thank you for doing what you're doing. It's a wonderful example. 2, thanks for taking a Saturday and coming here and explaining that to these folks and just showing off the awesome things you do. I mean, some people are just entertainers, and they get to entertain and be on stage and sing songs and act and whatever. This is what we do as water professionals, right? This is us on stage. This is what we get to show off, right? Thank you for taking a Saturday and doing that. And lastly, Judy, I just thank you for allowing me to moderate. It's been super fun. It's great to see others in the state of California doing wonderful things. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.